You must be aware the entire news cycle for the last week has been taken up by one single person, that's Donald Trump. So rather than diving into the maelstrom of massively differing opinions of what this all means, I'm going to avoid it completely because directly it doesn't affect Scotland at the moment, and something much more important is actually on the cards just now, which most of us are not aware of. Now, those of you who follow the blog of Leah Gunn Barrett will know that she published an article yesterday, I think it was, where she was pointing out that the Restore, I think it's called the Restore Scottish Sovereignty Group, RSS, somebody will correct me on whether I got the name right or not, had pointed out recently that a piece of European legislation has remained off the Scottish legislative books when it shouldn't be. You'll know that the Scottish Government had the right in the past to incorporate international law, particularly European human rights laws, into the Scottish legislature. In other words, making it part of our rights as individual Scots over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, what most people don't know is that there was a new piece of legislation brought out by the European Union called the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. Now, the ICCPR is unusual in that it adds to the rights already conferred by the European Convention of Human Rights, which we are already signed up to. But critically, this particular piece of legislation gives Scotland, if it accepts and incorporates this new piece of legislation into law, the right to hold referendums. It grants political power. That's what the P stands for in ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And of course, there's a very good reason why the United Kingdom would not want Scotland to have that particular piece of European legislation incorporated into its legislature. And in response to that, the RSS had written to the Scottish Government directly, asking them to incorporate the ICCPR into Scottish legislation. And they actually got a reply. And you'll know that I've complained for years, and many others have complained for years, that any ideas coming from other parts of the political sphere in Scotland which suggest that the Scottish Government should do something about something or anything, or any positive suggestions are largely ignored. Now, on this occasion, it wasn't ignored, but not for the reason that you're thinking. It wasn't ignored because the SNP government was particularly pleased about this possibility and wanted to do it. It was replied to by a civil servant working in the Scottish Parliament. Now, the civil service in the Scottish Parliament is classified as part of the Scottish Government, but it isn't really. And the person who replied to this one, Mr. Munro, is a UK salaried civil servant. He reports directly to Westminster. And he wrote back saying that under the terms of the Scotland Act 1998, that particular matter, that international law, that regulation coming from the European Union, was not a devolved matter, but it was reserved to Westminster. Now, the RSS pointed out that that's actually not the case. That under existing legislation, the United Kingdom had actually delegated responsibility for incorporating European human rights laws into the Scottish legislature. And because of that, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government directly does have the power to write this into law. But why did the civil servant say that it was reserved when it actually isn't, when the United Kingdom itself has told the Scottish Government that it's their responsibility to incorporate European human rights laws? Well, I think the obvious answer is that it would give Scotland the actual parliamentary powers, the competence that it actually needs, according to the UK Supreme Court, to hold a referendum on leaving the Union, because it would grant political power to Scottish sovereign citizens. And that's one thing that the United Kingdom could never permit. Question in my mind is, given the fact that RSS have pointed out that the Scottish Government can perfectly legally adopt this piece of European legislation into our human rights laws, will they do it? Remember that what's been pointed out is that the Scottish Government does have the right, and in fact has had that right delegated by the UK Government itself, to incorporate this law. Now, here is the question. Does the SNP have enough courage to write this piece of new human rights legislation into the Scottish statute books? Because it would then give the SNP no hiding place. It could not then say, oh, well, we don't have the competence to hold a referendum, because they then would have the same competence that they're talking about. The Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government would be able to hold a referendum on leaving the Union if the people of Scotland voted yes in a free and fair referendum. But will they? My guess is they probably won't, and I think they probably won't because the civil servant involved, this Mr. Munro at the Scottish Parliament, has probably told them that they better not, because despite the fact that technically they can, the British government's going to take a pretty dim view of it. I wonder actually whether the SNP or anybody actually, any MSPs in Holyrood, will have the courage to actually suggest this in Parliament. I doubt it somehow. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm misjudging the SNP, and that there are people in the Scottish Government who do have the wit to see the value of this little piece of legislation. It's not a huge change. It's the adoption of some new practices which are common across all the states of the European Union. Now, despite the fact that we are not in the European Union, we are still bound by its human rights laws because they're already part of the Scottish system. They're already written into Scottish law. So it wouldn't take a huge effort on the part of the Scottish Government to add this extra bit into that legislation, which would grant the Scottish Parliament the competence, the legal competence that it requires to hold a referendum. And therefore it's a critical enabling step which would allow us to hold a referendum on anything at all, actually. We could hold a referendum on leaving the UK. We could hold a referendum on rejoining the EU. We could hold a referendum where we offered the Scots the choice of either rejoining the EU as a member, not joining the EU as a member, or trading and relating to the EU through the European Free Trade Association. So there are so many possibilities that this piece of legislation would make real, that I think it's possibly the most important bit of unrecognised and unknown legislation that exists at the moment, which none of us, and even I, wasn't aware of it until a few days ago. So anyway, this programme is largely about that, because I think of all the news I've heard this week, disregarding the megalomania coming out of the White House at the moment, and the potential psychological harm that is doing to everybody in the Western world at the moment, we do need to keep focused on what's actually relevant to us at the moment. And this piece of legislation is vital. And if it gets into our law books in Scotland, if it goes on to our statutes, then it gives us the power to do what we need to do, which is to offer people a choice. At the moment, there is no choice. And at the moment, the right to political power, the right to act politically, is not part of our human rights sort of powers at the moment. It should be. It should always have been that way. And this, the ICCPR, is intended to correct that. I say we should go with it. I say that we should back the RSS and its efforts to get the Scottish Government to sign this into law immediately, while the United Kingdom is looking across the pond at Donald Trump and wringing its hands, because now is the time to do this, while the UK is looking the other way. They're not going to be too bothered about a little piece of legislation like this, which they probably weren't even aware of. Anyway, that is it for today. I just wanted to make this very simple show, and just to remind you that there is always some news which is hopeful for Scotland, and we could have the power to do what we need to do if our politicians would wake up and actually do it. And that is what this programme is making this happen. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.